Hello, welcome to Local Lives. Today I'm joined by the wonderful guest, Michelle Robinson. If you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm really honored to be here, really honored to have the team come here. Oki Naganago Mekoche Chestokomaki. I always try to say my name in Blackfoot first because I'm on Blackfoot territory. My name is Red Thunder Woman. I use she and her pronouns, but Michelle is preferred because that's quite what I've been used to most of my life. And I actually am Sahtu Dene, so my name is Tekot Nogotine Siku. And I was lucky enough to learn how to say that. That's about my knowledge, unfortunately, when it comes to how to pronounce my name. But I'm learning. I'm trying to reclaim just like a lot of other Indigenous folks. So.
Well, that's a wonderful
Yeah.
way to introduce yourself. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
To start off, I'd like to ask, how strong of a sense of community do you feel here in Calgary?
Oh, I think that this community specifically has a really great base, and they try to make as many community events as inclusive as possible. So I feel like it's quite open, and I feel like I've been able to walk my red road because of it. So I'm really grateful for our community here. Yeah.
Well, for those who wouldn't know, would you mind elaborating a little bit on what walking the red road implies?
Sure. So for a lot of us who are Indigenous, the opportunity to really be authentically ourselves, unfortunately, through government policy has really changed the narrative for us to be who we really are. So it is unfortunate that I am used to Michelle and introduce myself as Michelle, but my actual name is Red Thunder Woman. And I only know that because I started to listen to my elders. I started to follow our Indigenous protocols. And that concept, that's what we call walking the red road. And I'm really honored to do it. Actually, the opposite. I see us as a post-apocalyptic people. So for me to be able to carry on any type of tradition is an absolute wonderful thing to do for our ancestors and to honor them.
That's a really beautiful way of putting it.
Yeah.
I like that. That was good. Yeah. I usually include the both. Braden Cudlun is. So Cudlun would be my Inuinnaqtun name.
Oh.
It's my great grandfather's name, and then they can trace it generations back. So
Nice.
they say Inuit names carry the spirit, and so my mom can call me son or grandpa because to her I'd be both.
Oh.
If that
Yes, that makes total
So-
sense. Because for a lot of us who walk the red road, we always carry our ancestors with us. And for an Inuk to see it on the inside is like the most beautiful thing. And we're actually kind of cousins. The only thing that separates us is the tree line. But then, by economic displacement, I'm down here in Calgary and we're here in Calgary.
funny how it works out. Eh?
Yeah, that's right.
Sahtu Dene.
Yeah,
Caribou, lion.
that's right. That's right.
Grew up in Yellowknife and amongst the Dene.
Yeah, so that's my Indian Acton Post status card is
Oh,
Yellowknives
wow.
Dene.
That's really cool.
Yeah,
Oh, it's funny how things work out like that sometimes,
right?
especially since I just stumbled in your life that so many. That was about a year ago now, I think.
Right?
It's about a
Isn't
year.
that incredible?
Now we know a little about your sense of community in Calgary and the foundation and
Yeah.
your journey of reconnection and connectedness. Would you speak a little bit as to what you feel your role within the community as, I guess we could say, what it was and what it's transformed into?
Sure. So my name is Red Thunder Woman, and I was told by my elders that it's because I speak truth. And so I see myself as an advocate. I try to speak my truth, the truth about Indigenous perspective. And, it originally really started about safety for Indigenous women. And because for myself, I just knew, for myself and my daughter, how at risk we were. And that conversation wasn't actually part of the mainstream. So I was always talking about safety, Indigenous people's safety, and then I was gifted my name, and it just made sense with what I was doing. And I do see myself more as advocacy than anything. Yeah, that's how I see my role in community. And then as a mother, I see my role is to encourage my daughter to reclaim who she is without, without politics, without, trying to, I don't shield her from the reality. She knows what's happening, but at the same time, her just being authentically herself, of reclaiming who she is, reclaiming her language, reclaiming her identity, that's right where I like to put her, number one goals as a mom. And that intergenerational healing is just natural as long as you allow her to be her authentic self. So Sahtu Dene used to just call everybody they and them until the binary was imposed. So for me, trying to really be authentic and using they and them, I should be for myself as well as my daughter, but they are identifying as not fitting the heterosexual colonial mold. So using they and them gives them their authentic self. So I try to use they and them a little more actually than she and her. Yeah.
That was wonderfully said. I
Yeah.
got the tingles there. Well, speaking to your advocacy then, how has your experience through outreach and programs within the community influenced the online community you've built?
Yeah, so it was interesting. One of the first nonprofit roles that I was lucky enough to take was about safety and 12 communities that I reside in. And what I found was on the online community, a hashtag is a community. So if you want to talk about, Indigenous Twitter, there's a few different hashtags that you can use for that. YYC, very specific to Calgary, hashtag Calgary. So you can really use a hashtag in order to create a community. And so I found that to be really incredible when being on social media in general, and then promoting the local community events that were happening on social media as well, because so many of our people really are on social media. So they're more likely to see it there than they are through transit or their day-to-day. So I've really found utilized social media to try to help build community locally too.
Social media has really transformed advocacy and outreach programs as a whole, you could say.
Sure.
As you're saying, you can reach everybody directly in their home instead of hoping they walk by like a poster, or if you're talking and you hope they hear you and
That's
maybe they're
right.
not in the right mindset to hear you at that time.
Yep.
Versus, you're kind of scrolling and wow.
Yeah. And the great thing about social media is that I can amplify a voice that, like, bam, I could not have said that better, and maybe this person is like, I do find algorithms are a bit of a problem on social media. That's the only issue. So if I can generally find the most popular demographic to say what I need to say, I will share that, even though I would prefer it be an Indigenous voice. But in the hopes is the message gets out there, right? That thinking gets out there. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, do you feel like you've been better received on your online platform as opposed to in the physical community, I guess would be?
Yeah, I think there's give and takes of both, right? So I have an extensive block list, for example, online, because there are people who don't really want to hear. There are a lot of people who are there to cause drama, they're not being authentic about the message that I'm trying to communicate. And then conversely, in real life, you have a few folks that are like that too, right? So like, I find that by being in community, but also online community, that helps make you a real person, as opposed to, social media and media communicators. They're always putting out a message, but they're not necessarily in front of the camera in any capacity too. So it's interesting, because I want Indigenous inclusion in media and just community in general, because we're as Indigenous people, there are many of us who are in an urban setting now, and it's important that we are seen as part of the community in a good way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, speaking on that, I find it funny too, because I just had this realization the other day where, my grandfather lived nomadic.
Yeah.
And that's, a generation removed to me, where now it kind of feels like playing catch up.
Yeah.
And that's such a wide gap, hundreds of years to catch up in that kind of one generation. So I can definitely relate to that a lot, hearing that. So
Yeah.
I'm
Right?
probably gonna cry this. During this interview. I'm not
That's
gonna.
okay. I got a smudge. We can smudge after.
I'd love to hear how your perspective on how your online community has evolved. You know, seeing us especially that we both participated in the Indigenous Accelerator program.
Yeah,
there.
wasn't that a great opportunity to connect? Yeah, I found TikTok to be actually quite intimidating. I used to draft wells and pipelines, so I would use software like AutoCAD. The government would have their own software, so there was many like levels of different software that I was quite used to adapting within. But when it came to TikTok, there was something that made it. I think it because I'm the person, and I don't like that part. Like I would rather share an event. I would rather like share somebody else's, you know, gift of within the community. I'd rather put that on there. But with TikTok, it is a you only conversation. So I thought, well, you know, rather than putting out a tweet, I could like literally say my tweet. So it was quite intimidating for me, but it was really great to connect with so many Indigenous people that were just trying to figure it out as well. And again, back to like representation and media, you know, I think it's really important that we're all out there. And I would much rather retweet you than to put or to reshare one of your TikToks than to put mine out there. But at the same time, it's a fun balance to put my own content out there and see what resonates. That's always interesting to me. But I really love TikTok more for the fun stuff. I really prefer silly jokes, silly parts of all humanity, like Indigenous and non, or watching our little ones jig on TikTok,
Yeah.
like things like that just warm my heart so much. Watching dog accounts, like I love TikTok. It just, at the end of the day, I like to do the fun stuff so that I go to bed in a good way.
So it's a kind of a way to blow off steam a little bit.
Yes, yeah, it's like watching America's Funniest Home Videos, guaranteed every
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, TikTok too. There was a huge hunger I find for Indigenous representation. It's slowly being demands I find slowly being filled. So there's more and more Indigenous creators and content, and
Yeah.
they're so talented.
Right?
So
They
much-
really are. And some people know how to, you know, cut videos and splice them in such a good way. And I love those types of content creators, and I wish I could be those, but I'm just like a one and done type of person because I recognize sometimes I'll put out like 3 TikToks a day and then I'll have silence for 2 weeks, right? So just trying to be more consistent with putting it out there and saying what I need to say. Yeah.
Well, it can be hard if you're sharing like so vulnerable, as you're saying. Like that
Yeah.
level of vulnerability can be super emotionally draining,
Yeah.
especially with that wide reach that you can get. And
Yeah.
like, as you're saying, it is super authentic. Like you really are directly putting yourself there for like on a platform, and
Yeah.
since the algorithm can push you out so many ways, you know, it's crazy because people see this like 5 to 60-second clip and they think they got you figured out off that like tiny little clip, and
Yeah.
I could go on about that for it's a sensitive spot for me.
Yeah, yeah. I feel that though, and especially on Twitter, where someone can try to twist what you said in such a negative way. I'm like, how did you get there? Like, we were over here, you're way over here. How did that happen? So, and then remembering when you say this, there is a chance someone way over here will like really misread it. So, you know, trying to be authentic and at the same time just saying it and knowing if somebody does take it the wrong way, that's not necessarily a me problem, that's more of a them problem. So, you know, trying to balance that. And, you know, I think we all are taught to be good people, say good words, try to be kind, and make the world a better place. And that's kind of my goals of life, right? And if people want to twist that, that is more of a them issue than it is me. So
I like that, recognizing when it's out of your control as to how they got to their perspective.
right, and being willing to learn. I mean, you know, I grew up in a really negative belief system, negative towards women, LGBTQ, you know, and just that whole growing up in misogyny really taints your filter. So, you know, I've been unlearning my entire life. And I think that relearning the good way, the good road, the red road, has really helped me unlearn all of that, you know, I would say colonial belief systems. Yeah.
Been in that process myself lately, and it's
Yeah.
super tricky
Yeah.
because, you know, you don't recognize those thought patterns or those, you know, intrinsic behaviors right away.
Sure.
And then, you know, it sometimes takes someone pointing it out to you.
It really does have to be open to, you know, like real critique without internalizing it. And I was like, that's great advice. Like, that's exactly it, where, you know, I can hear other people's thoughts and opinions, but not internalize it. You know, having that spiritual but emotional barrier that I know I'm protected in a good way. And so just trying to balance and know and call yourself out, but being loving and gentle to yourself too as you try to walk this. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, it is a process, and
yeah.
if you're hard on yourself through all those steps, each step gets a little harder if you're
Yeah.
picking on yourself every time.
Right. So yeah, just knowing I don't know it. It's funny, the older you get, the more it's like I know nothing. But ironically, you know, more institutional knowledge in some capacity. So
How has your online activism influenced your real life?
for example, especially our elders, they don't have the digital literacy. So when I'm in
Oh.
real life, I can help people with their digital literacy a lot better than I can online. You know, somebody can ask a question, but it's different when you're in person, that whether or not it's resonating. I can tell if it's resonating with you, but online you can't tell. So sometimes it'll take 2 or 3 questions to get to the point, whereas when you're together, we can just do it and show each other how it works.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's really positive, and I think that that's kind of something that we have to see, all of us that are doing regularly, is helping each other with digital literacy, because in some ways I'm way more advanced, but in some ways I'm not. I'm like asking my daughter to help me. Great example of that though is that when I first got onto TikTok, I actually seen a lot of Indigenous people trying to reclaim who they are with a bit of misinformation. Right?
Okay.
So for me, I found being in community, I could say, well, you know, just look at this date. You know that, you know, treaty was 1877. You know the Indian Act was 1876. So you know that this actually doesn't follow the timeline, right? So I can do that conversation also online then too, and say, hey, for those who don't know. And I am surprised at how many people still don't know the Moose Hide campaign, or some of the initiatives that we have, Red Dress Day maybe, Sisters in Spirit Vigil Day, October 4th. Like, to me, these are like standard dates, but for a lot of people, they're not. You know, but ironically, like, I don't need an invitation from a veteran in order to attend a Remembrance Day ceremony. But for some reason, with that anti-Indigenous bias, some feel that they need that personal invite, and it's like, no, you just need to show up. These are our dates. You know, September 30th. Better be wearing that orange shirt, you know.
Do you have an idea maybe where that expectation for the invite might come from?
Yeah, I just think that anti-Indigenous bias has taught non-Indigenous that it's perfectly okay to steal and steal and steal. Steal the land, steal the ideas, steal the art, steal your time without compensation. Like, that, there's just no reciprocity when it comes to that. And I think that, you know, if you come from another country and believe that you're just allowed to take the land, you're allowed to take knowledge without compensation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's where it's rooted from, is that deep anti-Indigenous bias.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kind of building on that, and so out of sight, out of mind, kind of looking for an excuse to keep it out of mind as well.
Yeah.
This is great for me. I'm learning.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Like a sponge today. And so I understand you go by the user Native Calgarian. How did you come up with that?
Well, it's interesting, like Indigenous erasure is a big part of the barriers I'm fighting through, right? And ironically, a lot of non-Indigenous will say, oh, I'm a native Calgarian. And I'll just kind of snicker and I'll say, oh, what nation are you from? And they'll go, no, 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 I was born here. I'm like, oh yeah, no, I was born here too. I'd like to understand why you call yourself a native at all. I just can't. And when you kind of call people on that, they have to unpack, yeah, maybe this isn't the right name that I should be using. And especially in this time now where we're doing land acknowledgements and understanding treaty relationships, like I really do appreciate it when somebody says, I'm a 5th generation settler, because that's the right terminology for a treaty relationship, for reconciliation, right? And moving together in a good way, so.
That was wonderfully said.
I could definitely go on about Native Calgarian because I hear it a lot, like, and just trying to encourage people to really see their relationship with Indigenous, with treaty, with reconciliation in a different way, and honestly dropping that terminology, you know, is definitely a good start to that, and actually because of Indigenous erasure, a lot of folks other us. So they would never remember Michelle Robinson, but they might remember Native Calgarian.
What you were saying about truth and reconciliation, how we really are still in that. You know, you hear a lot like, how do we move forward when we're still in that truth aspect of truth? Before we can hit reconciliation, we still have to move through the truth.
Yeah.
And, you know, with the erasure, it's almost like a fight every day to be recognized and heard.
It really is.
Seen.
And that's why I really like Native TikTok and Native Twitter, because we can just be authentically ourselves without having to explain it to everybody. And then we're funny naturally. So it just, you get to have a joke or see some humor in things that are ridiculous. And like an example would be this hashtag that I love using, and it's Rec on Silly Nation. So, Wreck on Silly Nation.
I went over my head.
Yeah. So whenever I see, you know, something that's so ridiculous and they're like, this is not reconciliation, I put Wreck on Silly Nation. Just to kind of like, hey, this is so ridiculous. There's no other hashtag that's more appropriate.
Right over my head. I didn't even see it.
Oh no, it's such a funny one. So like, you know, and that's just it, like a funny hashtag that's Indigenous only. Yeah. That's the type of stuff I live for, because that just cracks me up.
Well, I really appreciated Native TikTok when I lived in a small little community in Nova Scotia there, and you know, I was the only like Indigenous people I was exposed to was like my parents, or I guess my mom and like my brothers, but we were far away from any like close reserves or anything, and you know, there's a certain humor that, as you're saying, you know, it's funny, but you know, you don't, the jokes aren't going to be caught by people outside of the Indigenous community, and so when, you know, being able to still see those on Native TikTok was like, you know, it was really welcoming, I guess.
Yeah.
In a way.
Well, it makes you feel at home, and that's the whole point. Like most non-Indigenous people see themselves in media, social media, but we don't. So having like Native TikTok, Native Twitter, Native, you know, community online, it just cracks me up, right? Like it just helps me feel like I am a little more home, even though I'm displaced.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I love that, because, you know, when you hear we need more representation from minorities, it's more than just TVs or movies.
A lot of us have never lived on reserve and may never, and in the States, reservation. So like it's really good at portraying it. And one of my favorite episodes was when the outsider comes in, because I've been that outsider. I'm like, yep, this is true. And you're just like, I know that's how we sound. So yeah, I think it's important we have representation so that we can, you know, really enjoy media the way that non-Indigenous people do.
Absolutely. It was actually in an earlier interview where it was me and my partner were discussing it with the representation. It's kind of like taking that box off.
Yeah.
That you kind of grow up in, or you feel like you've been put in your whole life, and with all this new representation,
Yeah.
It's like removing it. It's so freeing seeing it.
Right? And my daughter, she's growing up in a world that has representation, and I didn't. So for me, like, I bawled. I think it was, want to say 2015 Junos, where they had, the opening was Indigenous, and I was just, if you turned it on right now, I'd probably cry, because I didn't grow up with any representation of that. Supermodels, hockey players, it doesn't matter. We're everywhere now. Yeah, and at least getting some spotlight.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you're in a position where you would be that representation now. How would younger you, I guess, receive your position where you are now in the media and advocacy?
Yeah, I think about that. I think about all of the folks that were advocating when I was younger that I didn't see because the media wouldn't report it. And, it was different then, right? Because we didn't have social media, we didn't have these computers. So it was a different time. If it wasn't in the printed newspaper, it didn't exist. If it wasn't on the CBC, it didn't exist. And even what was on the CBC was still a colonial lens as opposed to an Indigenous lens, right? So Oka, for example, really hurt my heart, and I didn't understand anything. So, if little me seen what I was doing now, they wouldn't believe it, one. And two, I hope that the next generations, I see lots of new podcasts coming out, and I try to share them often because to me, I know that regardless, I've been consistent for years now. And I want them to feel like they can be consistent for years too.
That's a great answer.
Yeah.
Well, now, on the other end of that, what would you, if you could say something to your younger self, what do you think that would be?
Oh, one day you'll understand Indigenous culture, and then you'll feel whole. And I think that's what it was until I started walking the red road, I knew something was wrong, something was missing, nothing made sense. And then when I started walking the red road, everything made sense. And I felt like I could, for the first time, authentically knew who I was. So that's kind of what I would tell myself, is that one day you will know who you are. Right now you don't, but one day you will. So
Reconnecting is truly healing.
Yes, and they say that I'm a facilitator for White Bison Society, Mending Broken Hearts. And, culture is prevention, and understanding, deconstructing colonial trauma heals you, right? So if you do have an addiction issue, that helps you understand why better. Yeah.
That was well said.
Yeah.
So on a different note, when did you start advocating?
So when I had my daughter, I experienced systemic racism in the hospital. And when that happened, I realized that I have a role to play in stopping systemic racism in the hospital. And when midwifery got funded in Alberta, it's just one tiny thread in many issues of barriers that we face. So I just knew my path was to continue talking about whatever was happening in front of me. And that's really what my podcast is that unfortunately every single day we experience some level of racism. Sometimes it's the systemic, sometimes it's individual, and then sometimes it's really inside. It's ourselves that we sometimes will perpetuate onto each other. So you're always fighting those three levels of racism. And so when I wake up and I kind of figure out what racism am I dealing with today, that's where it comes from. And the hope is, to me, all of our efforts should be dismantling systemic racism, because the individual and the internalized racism will eventually go away. Once we focus on that collectively, then we can live together in a better way. And I really want to do that more for the next generations. I'm already in my 40s, so I'd love to have the rest of my life positive, but I really want it better for my daughter and for the next generations.
Wow.
Yeah.
So do you have any advice for anyone who is looking for their voice?
I think the biggest thing is talking to the elders. I was lucky enough to find good elders here locally that were willing to teach me. And then I'm a reader, so I started reading Indigenous books, and that really helped me understand it better. But you know, the thing about walking the red road is that there's these unexpected things that hit you that you don't expect. And an example would be Jeremy Dutcher. I didn't expect to be so emotionally hit when I seen our elders of 200 years ago singing. It hit me so hard I bawled the entire concert. So like it's a good thing. It's mourning something you didn't even know you were mourning. And for me, I think the advice I would tell our people is just that know that your ancestors are always with you, one. That's the number one thing. But two, talk to your elders. And it was my elders who said, if you're hurt, confused, lay tobacco. And that changed my life. It changed my life. So, you know, that was my road. That was the start. But for others, it might be different, and that's okay. There's not a wrong way to do it either, to reclaim who you are. Yeah.
I don't think you could have, or we could have asked for better advice.
Yeah.
That was you got me tearing up a little. Well, I've asked you about when you found your voice and advice for those looking for their voice. So is that kind of what led you into creating your podcast?
Yeah. My poor husband, like, God bless his soul. You know, he would hear these stories and he couldn't believe it. He believed me, obviously, but he just couldn't believe how regular and often it was. And he was just like, put a mic in front of me and said, start talking. And you know, that was me putting my voice into a podcast, because I think there is such a disconnect between Canadians and Indigenous people, that hearing it on a regular basis, that's what they need to understand how we're so vastly different. And I get that myself when I listen to LGBTQ2+, when I listen to Black voices, Sikh, Muslims. Like, when you listen to other people's voices, you know, we're all kind of isolated in our own ways, but we have to come together. And I do believe diversity is our strength. And when we're all together and we're working together, like, we can move mountains. So
Amplifying and those voices and holding space for them, making sure they're not just listened to but heard.
100%. And that's the other part, is having it resonate with Canadians. And I think it's easy for you and I to be like, we have treaty rights. It's easy for us to talk about that. But for Canadians, they don't understand that. But when they call themselves a native Calgarian, and I'm like, tell me how native you are, they're like, oh, they unpack it in a different way, right? So sometimes that's kind of the power of the TikTok, of the, you know, putting it out there in a way that they've never seen it before, right? So.
Well, it's, you were speaking about those levels to racism, and I think the third one you mentioned would include microaggressions, and that's something, you know, a lot of people have a hard time understanding, or
Yes.
because those are just like in like a quick, like an instant.
Yeah.
And it's hard to, you know, sometimes when you hear them, you don't notice until you get home and you're like, oh wait, something was fishy about that.
Right, and it's you know, death by 1,000 cuts, because if you hear it every single day and it's just a tiny little cut, you eventually like recognize, like, this is really killing me. So there is a terminology actually for it called racial battle fatigue. Yeah, when you hear enough racism and like, all you have to do is open up the comment section of any media and you're like, ooh, racial battle fatigue. And the media is, you know, anti this and that. And the more that you can unpack all of that, the more you see it, and the more you can challenge it and be like, hey, this isn't real. But on TikTok, none of that mainstream influence is really like guiding it completely. So we can be authentically ourselves. And I'm learning so much from all the different other communities too. And because they get to be authentically themselves without the filter.
That was that, that authentic,
Yeah, and I think that's what we all want, is to be authentically ourselves. And, you know, and that's really, I don't know, we're really challenging the status quo in a different way. And I'm really honored and proud to be a part of not just being Indigenous as like survivors of post-apocalyptic world, but also like to honor the Indian residential schools survivors for what they endured. And in my case, you know, family violence, to honor my family that was able to survive that. And I don't want that for the next generations. I don't want them to have to survive a ridiculous trauma in order to have the next generations. I just want them to thrive and heal and have joy.
To break those cycles.
Yeah, exactly. But they won't stop until we hit systemic racism, because the system is designed to continue to perpetrate that trauma. And so we have to stop that first.
Right from the root.
And that's when you'll find all the aunties and elders will be like, yes. Fly, little bird. But you know, my partner keeps me grounded. And that's the best part about having a good support team, is that they help you keep grounded when you maybe need to land for a bit.
Yeah. I'm in that same boat.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's why it was funny, because my family and my partner too are always like, don't get carried away.
Yeah, no, they'll keep you tethered. But in a good way, I think a lot. My husband's name is Big Buffalo Rock Man, and like that's like a solid part of the land. And then here's Red Thunder Woman flying around, right, with the thunder beings. So it's you need each other in order to be whole.
The balance.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's cool how that worked out.
Yeah.
That's definitely a reason.
Yeah, it really is.
That is beautiful.
And that's good. That means you heard it, and it's resonating, and that feels good for my spirit too.
I just want to make sure we capture what you have to say and your story in the best light and the best way that we can, and hopefully elevate.
Yeah, well, and vice versa. I hope that a lot of people are following you, because you're our next generation. You're the youth that's leading us. So
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Wonderful compliment. Yeah. So for someone who's so actively involved in the community and all these different organizations and your social media and your podcast, how do you find time for it all?
Well, I think that, luckily my family wants to do these events, luckily. But the other thing is that a lot of events that I share, I just know I can't be at. And sometimes I let people know that, but other times I just share it in the hopes that other people will go. It is hard to find balance sometimes. And, I don't know what the right answer is, because in a lot of ways, sometimes we're in survival mode, but in other ways, you got to have joy. You got to do the powwows and the fun stuff too. So the Making Treaty Sevens that do the plays and the productions, it's just wonderful to have that representation and to be able to go to those types of things. So, I just try to make sure we have lots of fun stuff as well as the hard stuff. And for the hard stuff, never an expectation for my family to be there, because go have fun, go watch a fun movie, whatever you want to do, but I'm going to stand there and talk about whatever the topic of the moment is. So
You've taken a lot of responsibility on.
Well, I think that once you recognize who you actually are as an Indigenous person, you feel that responsibility, because you're honoring your ancestors that got you to this moment, but you're also trying to create a better world and honor the next generations that you're borrowing the land from. So I think that naturally you end up with that incredible amount of responsibility and understand the gravity of it in a way that maybe I certainly can speak for myself and say, prior to walking the red road, I knew there was something bigger for me, but I didn't understand what it was.
Yeah, I'm getting emotional too.
Yeah, well, these are because we're not just having an interview, we're reclaiming our identity. We're reclaiming who we are as people, and supporting each other as we go through it, and mourning what we lost, but making space for new things. So it's a lot. It's a lot, and so it is really emotional.
I'm fairly early into my own healing journey and really reconnecting, so I'm really resonating with a lot of the things you're saying, and how they're saying it, or sorry, how you're saying it, and since it's so fresh,
Yeah,
it's like, oh, I haven't thought about this in a little while, and
yeah,
I kind of put my own advocacy kind of on the side a little bit for education, so I could
yeah.
further my capacity to really educate not only myself but others in the process.
Right, and really you can't advocate ignorantly. So to me, it is important that you're walking the education route, or and that was part of the impetus of having the book club, was that there were certain books I knew I had to read, and there were people that wanted to come on the journey of reading them with me, and it is that constant learning of new truths. We can't reconcile until we know the truth, and that takes education, that takes understanding, that takes time of unpacking what it is that has happened to lead us to this moment.
Absolutely. So do you find through the book club then having that, I guess, little community to learn with, does that help?
So much so, and like for the non-Indigenous who are really compelled to act, we actually created the Reconciliation Action Group in order to help them continue with their advocacy, because honestly, you and I should be working on our healing and reclaiming. The non-Indigenous should be working on structural racism. And unfortunately, we're still in the position we have to do all of it because the non-Indigenous don't see their responsibility yet as treaty partners and in reconciliation. So until they do, we just have to kind of do all of it for now, but healthily and with balance. And I'm perfectly okay with any Native just surviving and living their good life, right? And hopefully one day we'll have worked enough at systemic racism that people can be authentically themselves.
Speaking on that, of the non-Indigenous who, may recognize their responsibility to be an ally and an advocate, do you have any advice for those and how they can best practice?
Yeah, sure. So my biggest advice to non-Indigenous is understand that this is Indigenous-led. So if you don't have an Indigenous person on your team that you're listening to, you might be doing the wrong direction. Have it Indigenous-led, but also have it truth and reconciliation focused. I also talk a lot about the National Inquiry Report as well. So, those voices, I live my life centering their voices. And ironically, although I have to deal with the ramifications of Indian residential school, loss of identity, and violence against Indigenous women, even though that's my own path, that bigger path is all of the folks who put together those reports, who put together those voices. Those are the people I center my reality around. There are always Indigenous people in your area, and if you can't seem to attract them, that is your anti-Indigenous bias that's stopping you. So, read the books, listen to podcasts, and beyond mine. There's so many great Indigenous authors, there's so many great Indigenous podcasts, documentaries. I have Indigenous politicians, Indigenous media. Wind Speaker is a local one here that is just fantastic. These are the organizations that I go to, APTN, to try to see, because they have the budget to go and get all of the information. And for my book club, they're mainly Indigenous authors that we read. So that's kind of where, if you're not centering Indigenous voices, you're doing reconciliation wrong. And the hope is that you see the socioeconomic barriers that have been purposely in place for over 150 years, that you'll even pay your Indigenous liaisons, the folks in your life, dismantling racism. Community-wise here in Calgary has a whole protocol for nonprofits on how to do anti-racism work and structural changes. So it's actually called like anti-racism organizational change. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. That was created with QT BIPOC voices centered. So these are the initiatives that I really encourage non-Indigenous to consider. Like if you're a sports club, community association, a nonprofit, there are business. There's so much work for us to do here, and so many great voices that we can lean into in order to create those solutions.
Yeah, that was amazing. So this is a bit of a loaded question to build off that.
Sure.
Would you mind maybe naming a few attributes that you would say a good ally would possess?
Yeah, so amplifying Indigenous voices, deferring to Indigenous voices, paying Indigenous voices, and doing the action, the work of it. So those are kind of like things that I see, and I hear it in the way they speak. If they acknowledge treaty, acknowledge, how we're trying to reconcile, but we have to get the truth first. Like these are things I hear in allies that mean it.
So to go back to an earlier point, to not just listen but to hear.
Yeah, and to act. Like there has to be act. If it's just you and me talking, and all I'm hearing from non-Indigenous is, "Oh, this is a good first step," they're not hearing us. They're not knowing they have to act.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, I know you've heard that way too many times. We hear that way too many times, and every generation has heard it way too many times, right? We need non-Indigenous to include us in our curriculum, K to 12, university, everything, and until that's done, like we're not tackling systemic racism.
How then can non-Indigenous work towards better holding the space?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure there's a reconciliation committee everywhere, and there needs to be if there isn't. So if you're in a sports club and there's no reconciliation committee, make one. If you're in a business and there's no reconciliation committee, make one. There's no way that you shouldn't be in a reconciliation committee in some capacity. Maybe it's a simple book club. Maybe it's your church group. There's something somewhere that people can be doing this work within. And it's important for no other reason than you and I know it doesn't matter if we're playing hockey. If we don't fist pump each other every so often, you kind of get, you lose that will to want to continue to play the game. So that's what we need. We need to be encouraging each other. And like you'll see me share a lot of non-Indigenous organizations, group, or people to try to inspire other non-Indigenous people.
To speak on organizations you've worked with, would you mind sharing about a few and maybe the ones that have been most impactful to you?
Sure. So when I was born in Calgary in 1977, and the 3 years that my parents were together were filled with domestic violence and my first memories of life, there was no shelter at that time. There was no Awaton Healing Lodge at that time. Awaton Healing Lodge is the only Indigenous urban shelter there is. So for me, a lot of the Sisters in Spirit vigils go through that, and that has helped me with my healing journey in such a good way, because I could connect with other Indigenous people that have had that childhood trauma of domestic violence, or unfortunately sometimes in their adult life. I'm lucky I haven't really had that other than from extended family members, but when it comes to my life and my circle, my hope is my daughter will heal from domestic violence thanks to organizations like Awaton Healing Lodge. There's Urban Society for Aboriginal Youth, so we call it USAY here, and they just focus on Indigenous youth-led initiatives, no matter what it is. They'll go to movie night or any other Indigenous movie, but they're a community. They've created a community, and they go for dinner, and then they'll work on projects. Maybe they'll help the Calgary Police with something, or they'll help another organization, or they'll talk about periods or sexual health, whatever it is, to help them relearn who they are as Indigenous people in a safe space, and learn about the world around them with as much Indigenous teachings as they can. And I just have nothing but positive things to say, because I certainly did not have an organization like that growing up. So for me, these are two, like off the top of my head, that are so impactful. I was a co-founder to two other organizations, because our Two-Spirit, those who identify as gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, they experience the world differently. And I'm straight and cis, and I see it, let alone experience it. So for me, they are some of the most sacred people to be protecting. So, advocacy in that sense. And that is part of the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The Two-Spirit is a huge component of that. And gendered violence is a huge issue in the LGBTQ2 plus community from the rest of the system. So we want to stop that immediately, because that gendered violence is something that we need to protect our most sacred, who I see in our Two-Spirit.
Yeah, I think I could listen to you all day. What has allowed you then to have been such a strong and consistent voice within the community?
It's my girl. It's my girl. And in the next generations, we just need a better world for them to be authentically themselves. And I think we're in a position, this generation, Generation X. So the last residential school closed in '96, according to the TRC. But '97 was Cowidness First Nation. They said that was when theirs closed. I graduated high school in '94. So for me, we're one of the first generations to just not have, well, other than, other colonial trauma, not have a government policy separating us from our family. The scoop is still ongoing. So there are a lot of kids scooped. And that until we stop that systemic racism, can kids reconnect to who they are, et cetera, et cetera. So allowing children to reconnect to their families and stopping that harm, that trauma, like, until that's done, like, you have to, like, I feel so compelled, that responsibility to keep families reunited in the hopes that they can heal together.
My mother was a residential school survivor, so I relate strongly to those words and that sense of responsibility and the passion to really pave that road forward.
Yeah.
It's tough, it's tricky.
It is tricky, but it in a way, it's, I tell people that what my grandma lived through was absolutely inhumane. What my mom has lived through is absolutely inhumane. I have not had that hard road that they've been forced to live. So I just feel that that responsibility to be like, somehow I'm here thanks to their, I don't want to say sacrifices, but because of what they went through. And in order to make a better world for my daughter, I have to do this until every piece of systemic racism is done, and then we can focus on just living and existing happily.
In a way, honoring the past generations by ensuring and providing for the next.
Right?
Well, do you have any advice for those who are within the community who are looking to extend their voices into advocacy?
First and foremost, there's enough room at the table for all of us. I never want any Indigenous voice to feel like it's lesser. It's not. It's needed. Every perspective is needed, and just to continue to work on, your education, your teachings from your community, and moving forward and learning your voice. Like, just do it, and you'll be here, no question.
And speaking on the significance of ensuring Indigenous voices are not only listened to, but deeply heard, and that action is followed?
I hope that, especially with a medium like TikTok, that we can really just be authentically ourselves. We have to accept the fact that some people aren't gonna ever listen to us. But to be fair, I'm not ever gonna listen to some other voices too. So, we just have to work with what we have and help our youth to be as strong as they can. That's it. That's all we can really do. That's all we can control. So just recognizing that a lot of things are out of our control, but the things that are in our control is just to be authentically ourselves, help each other, and move forward together. Like, literally, I see it as walking the journey together, right? And sometimes other people have this path, and I might have to go down this path, and sometimes our paths will come back together, but we are just walking a journey. Yeah.
Perfect. And what do you hope the community as a whole can take away from this interview today?
Oh, I hope the non-Indigenous communities see that we're just part of the community, and I hope the Indigenous feel inspired to be authentically themselves. So, we're going to have to figure out this treaty relationship that our ancestors really believed in. But for the non-Indigenous, seeing the systemic racism that has caused an imbalance in this relationship, my hope is that we'll be seeing a world of more equity, that we'll be seeing, revenue sharing, land sharing. A lot of Crown land could easily be better managed by Indigenous people to help with climate change crisis, etc. So I think we have all the solutions we need in the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, the National Inquiry report. We have all the answers and solutions we need. We just have to start walking this journey together.
Wonderfully said. Well,
Yeah.
my last question for you is, I forgot to mention this. There's a lot of conversation and worry within non-Indigenous people where they're scared and unsure of how to navigate appropriation versus appreciation. Do you have any words that might clarify?
Yeah, sure. If you're non-Indigenous, buy from Indigenous artists, and you can wear that knowing you have a message to send. So when somebody asks you, "Oh, why are you wearing that red scarf?" Notice we both are. We know why, but maybe for a non-Indigenous, when they're wearing that red scarf, being able to articulate why, right? Maybe those beaded earrings, where you got them, whose community it came from, why you got them. There's a story behind all of that. Now, when it comes to actually making Indigenous art, that is appropriation, point blank. And there are so many, artists that talk about it. So obviously I defer to those artists. For me personally, as a podcaster, no one can take away my voice, right? There's more Indigenous to come to the table and say their truths, because so we have over 600 nations. We have so many teachings. We have so much to, teach our children with, right? So for cultural appropriation, I'd really like to see, Indigenous-led smudging, not non-Indigenous-led smudging, because those medicines have so many teachings to them. And, I don't want to see non-Indigenous, basically take all of our medicines, right? Because there is a technique so you don't ruin them in the sense that, pulling out roots and such, right? Anyway, so much to really unpack there. Not Your Mascot is a really good hashtag to talk about why it's so harmful to have Indigenous caricatures as mascots. And we right here in the city of Calgary, the Diefenbaker Chiefs is a real thing. And, so trying to dismantle that type of systemic racism. And I guess seeing it as that, cultural appropriation is racism. So, yeah.
It's a pretty fine line, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of attempts at blurring it.
Yeah, I know that, and that's really just white fragility, really and truly, trying to take on something that isn't theirs to take.
I just want to touch on one last part where you briefly mentioned over 600 nations, and all 600 nations typically get put under a monolith.
Pan-indigenized. The danger of pan-indigenizing.
Yeah.
When you had said you were in Inuk, my people are just south of you at the tree line there at Sahtu Dene. Our culture is so vastly different because of the land. The language is different, the customs are different, the food is different, right? So the idea that we could be pan-indigenized, even though we're legitimate neighbors, that really bothers me that so many people don't see the distinction. But we'll be quick to, categorize maybe the Mohawk as warriors and the Blackfoot as warriors and the Haida for their art. And that is true to some extent, but Haida were also warriors, and the warriors that they see, actually there were women there that they didn't see, right? There's an erasure there. So just really being authentic about the bigger picture of each culture would be, really great for people to quit with that. I mean, we already say First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. We already say that, right? But the First Nations, there's over 600 of us. You know, even the Inuit, there's huge diversity in the Inuit culture. Same with the Métis. So it would really be great to have the world like see that we are multi different. Just as you would never, you say to any Canadian, "Oh, are you an American?" Oh, oh! But yet you and I are constantly categorized in that idea, right? Like as a Calgarian, for somebody to mistake me as an Edmontonian. Oh, you know, honestly, right? So I try to kind of incorporate that in the teaching to non-Indigenous about, you know, the dangers of pan-Indigenizing, right? Like, you put an English and a French person together and be like, yeah, you're the same. They would be horrifically offended.
So that is a really good,
Yeah.
plainly put, blunt example.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm definitely going to adopt into my own
Absolutely.
discourses. Well, that's all I have for you today. Thank you
Wonderful.
so much. Kwanakahi, Kuya Huktunga, I'm grateful.
Maxi Cho.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, I'm just really honored. I'm really proud of the work you're doing, and I hope that you have all the best interviews moving forward too, because you deserve it.
Well, thank you so much, and
You're
thanks for
welcome.
being our guest. It's all for Local Lives today.